Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon if you're in mainland Europe or Middle East or Africa. Hopefully you can all hear me okay and see my screen. My name is Spencer Allingham, and I'm the Regional Vice President and Technical Director at Conducive for the EMEA region. Today, I'd like to introduce you to the V-locity software that you can use to speed up your SQL servers without having to reboot machines and without any SQL code changes being required. Now, if you've got any questions as I'm going through, you're very welcome to put them in the questions box in that GoToMeeting window, and I'll do my very best to answer them all in a Q&A session at the end. Similarly, there's a little chat box in there. I would love to get a bit of feedback from you guys and hear what it was that piqued your interest to come along today. Maybe some of you have experienced performance problems or user complaints about things being slower than you would like them to be. Let me know, and we'll see if we can help you achieve faster performance and really get that productivity that you want out of SQL and other types of workloads as well. So to illustrate why you might want to consider downloading and installing the V-locity software onto your SQL servers, I ran some lab tests using HammerDB to generate an online transaction processing type workload with and without V-locity installed. Firstly, using SSD storage and then using spinning disk storage. And as you can see from the metrics recorded by HammerDB, over the SSD storage, there was about a 30% improvement in the number of SQL transactions that could be processed per minute. And this was backed up by Windows Perfmon metrics, well, Windows Performance Monitor. And that showed roughly a 28% improvement in transactions per second. When running the tests again using that spinning hard drive storage, there was around 100% improvement. Now, regardless of the storage type that you have in your environment, either way, this has got to be good news for SQL DBAs who care about the performance of the databases underpinning their business critical applications. Now, whether you're running SQL in a physical or a virtualized environment, most SQL DBAs would welcome faster storage at a reasonable price. And Conducive's V-locity software is designed to provide exactly that, but using the storage hardware that you already own. It doesn't matter if you've got direct attached disks, if you're running a tiered SAN, have a tray of SSD storage, or are fortunate enough to have an all-flash array. That storage layer can be a limiting factor to your SQL database's productivity. Now, the V-locity software reduces the amount of storage I/O traffic that has to go out and be processed by the disk storage layer. And it streamlines or optimizes the data, which does still have to go out to disk. And the net result is that SQL can get more transactions completed in the same amount of time, quite simply because on average, it's not having to wait so much on that storage before being able to get on with its next transaction. And V-locity can be downloaded and installed without any disruption whatsoever to live SQL servers. No SQL code changes are required and no reboots. All you have to do is just simply install, and typically you'll start seeing positive results in just a few minutes. Now, before we take a more in-depth look at that, I would like to briefly mention that the V-locity software was awarded the Microsoft SQL Server I/O Reliability Certification, which is quite a mouthful. Now, this basically means that whilst providing faster storage access, V-locity didn't adversely affect the required and recommended behaviors that an I/O subsystem must provide for SQL as defined by Microsoft themselves. Now, most SQL DBAs are familiar with why split pages are bad for performance. If you've got room and your update or insert doesn't require a split, well, this is pretty fast because SQL is just updating one page and then writing it out to disk and of course to the transaction log. But if the updated or inserted row doesn't fit, SQL needs to allocate a new page, move about half of the rows to the new page, and then write both pages to disk and to the transaction log. In addition, any pages in all of the indexes that point to the data pages, well, they need to be updated too. So as an example, let's say that your table had one clustered index and 4 non-clustered indexes. That would mean at least 7 pages would need to be updated. You'd have 1 for the clustered index structure, 4 for the non-clustered indexes, and 2 in the data pages in the clustered index. So this page split would result in a minimum of 7 times the I/O as an insert or update that didn't require a page split. Now, each I/O that takes place takes a measurable amount of time and resource to process. And the same is true when the Windows file system splits data as it writes out to that logical NTFS volume. And that can have significant performance ramifications too. And this is basically why SQL DBAs format volumes to be used by SQL with a 64 kilobyte cluster size, rather than just leaving the NTFS default of 4 kilobytes. It helps to avoid split I/O situations when writing to disk, and it keeps performance draining file fragmentation from building up so quickly. But it doesn't actually fix the problem though. As your NTFS file systems mature over time and files are created, extended, and deleted, the free space on the NTFS volume will become more and more fragmented into smaller and smaller free space extents, increasing those split I/O situations when writing. And each time your write is split in this way, the data is being sent out to disk in separate storage I/O packets and at a slower data transfer rate. Unlike split pages in SQL, each storage I/O takes a measurable amount of time and resource to process. So in the real world, a gigabyte of storage I/O traffic that should be written in 2,000 or 3,000 I/Os could now be taking 30,000 or 40,000 I/Os to complete. And we call the performance penalty that these split I/O situations cause the Windows I/O tax, as in a tax on your performance due to the split I/Os. In a virtualized environment, this performance penalty can be amplified by something called the I/O blender effect. And what's happening here is that you have small fractured I/O packets coming from the virtual machines. And as they pass through the hypervisor, which could be VMware ESX or ESXi server or a Hyper-V host, the hypervisor mixes these I/O streams together, causing a randomization effect. So basically, what comes out between the physical host hypervisor and the disk storage controller is now a chaotic mess of small, fractured, and now very randomized I/O streams that, by the time they hit the storage controller on the back end, couldn't be less storage friendly. It means that the storage controller is only receiving data in very small packets at a time. So it now only has the opportunity to create very small stripes across its media. And that means many more storage level operations than if the data simply hadn't been split up as it was being written all the way up at that NTFS layer. Now, the V-locity software helps Windows avoid or prevent most of the excess, unnecessary, performance-losing split I/O traffic and displaces that with far fewer storage I/O packets, but each one carrying a larger payload of data so that it can be dealt with in a much more sequential manner. This makes the movement of data between server and storage a lot more efficient, and it provides faster data transfer rates and greater throughput of data, much like avoiding page splits in SQL wherever possible. And it allows the disk storage to store the data using far fewer storage level operations. And the V-locity software will also help create those nice large free space extents quietly and automatically in the background using only otherwise idle compute resources to make it easier for the Windows write driver to write into. So Think for a moment of a busy freeway or motorway at rush hour. Imagine that you've got lots and lots of cars all sitting bumper to bumper with one person in each car, and none of them are getting anywhere very quickly. It's a big traffic jam. Now, imagine that each car on the motorway is a storage I/O packet, and each person in each car is your data. What V-locity in effect is doing is taking all of the people out of the cars and putting them in buses or coaches and getting rid of all of the cars from the motorway and getting rid of all of that congestion, so that now all of the people or your data can now flow to their destination in a much more efficient manner. I hope that makes sense as an analogy. But really, that's only half of the story. V-locity also introduces a RAM caching technique into the Windows operating system that further reduces the read I/O traffic that the backend storage has to deal with. The performance benefits provided are in addition to SQL's own buffering and any caching natively provided by the Windows OS. And this basically is how we could get 30% more SQL transactions done in the same amount of time during that testing that I mentioned before. Quite simply, SQL could get more work done in the same amount of time because it wasn't having to wait so much on the disk storage layer before being able to get on with its next transaction, and because, frankly, RAM is faster than disk storage. Oh, and it absolutely works with both physical and virtualized SQL servers. And it also works in the cloud as well. Storage I/O reduction, optimization, and RAM caching represent a significant reduction in workload that has to be processed by the backend storage. This is not only true of SQL storage traffic, but other workload types too. So let's use this example on the screen. Let's say that the first virtual machine is hosting your SQL database, and the second VM is hosting the application that interfaces with SQL, and the other two VMs are hosting very busy file servers, and they're all sharing that same backend storage. You might have a situation where the traffic from the file servers are taxing the performance of SQL just simply by keeping the storage layer busy. So SQL isn't necessarily the cause of the disk storage being slow, but it would likely be affected by the increased disk I/O queue depths and increased latency caused by the busy workloads on the file servers. So my recommendation would be to install the V-locity software on all of the Windows machines, or as many as you can install on, that are sharing that same backend storage. That way, from the point of view of the storage, it's now doing the least amount of work, regardless of which VM is generating the most workload at any given time. So don't just limit your thoughts to just SQL. It works very well with other database technologies as well. Oracle running on Windows, MariaDB, MySQL, and also other workload types as well. So if you've got an ERP environment or a business information environment or a document management system, SharePoint, Microsoft Dynamics, think about getting the software onto those other machines as well to reduce that storage workload as much as you can. That won't just help SQL, it'll help every workload that you're running. So I hope that makes sense. Now, at this point, some of you keen DBAs will be thinking, yes, but SQL is already using most of the available memory in the machine. How can you possibly create a RAM cache? And that's a great question. It's true that if SQL is left uncapped, often there wouldn't be enough RAM for conducive software to create a cache with. We've intentionally designed our software so that it can't compete for system resources with anything else that's running, so that we can never be the cause of a memory starvation situation. V-locity would only use some of the free RAM that isn't being used by anything else, and it will dynamically size its cache, handing RAM back to Windows if other processes or applications need it. So for best results, you can easily cap the amount of RAM that SQL takes for its own form of caching or buffering. On busy database servers, if you can leave 16 gigabytes of RAM free, you'd have a velocity cache size that would be enough to really make that machine's performance fly. If you can't spare 16 gigabytes, leave 8 gigabytes. If you can't afford 8 gig, leave 4 gigabytes free. Even that is enough to make a difference. If you start going much smaller than that though, then the cache size for velocity would really be a bit too small, and any performance improvements would be limited. You might also be thinking, well, do you know what? I think SQL's buffering is good enough. So how does velocity's caching complement that? And at a basic level, SQL's cache does do a pretty good job. And whilst that does have a positive impact on performance, velocity's RAM caching is designed to eliminate the type of storage I/O traffic that tends to slow the storage down the most. And whilst that tends to be the smaller, more random read I/O traffic, it's actually not always the case. So Velocity uses a very lightweight storage filter driver to gather telemetry for its artificial intelligence and machine learning. And this allows the software to learn useful things like, what is the main application in use on a machine? Is it SQL or is it something else? What type of files are being accessed and what type of storage I/O streams are being generated? And at what times of the day, the week, the month, the quarter? So it can be very intelligent about what the hot blocks of data are that need to be in the RAM cache, and just as importantly, when. It can also use that telemetry to figure out how best to size the storage I/O packets to give that main application the best performance. If the way you use that machine changes over time, Velocity will automatically adapt to those changes without you having to reconfigure or tweak any settings. Now, validating results is very easy. First of all, you could measure the amount of SQL transactions that are being done each day to see if they increase. You can use Windows Performance Monitor for that. Some customers see reports that they generate take less time to produce, or SQL batch imports take less time. Other batch jobs might complete more quickly. Some customers have even done a simple stopwatch test to measure record retrieval times. But Velocity itself comes with very transparent reporting that will show you exactly how much storage I/O traffic it's able to eliminate from the disk storage layer. You can see what percentage of the reads and writes are being eliminated, and it will show you how much storage time is being saved by the storage not having to process that eliminated I/O. That storage time that's freed up to process other additional workloads. Now, if you're using thin provisioned storage, Velocity can also help you reclaim space and manage that thin provisioned storage. For example, if you're using thin provisioned VMDK files in VMware or dynamic disks in Hyper-V, it can automatically zero out the free space for you quietly in the background using idle resources so that you don't have to wait for hours for an sdelete pass to complete. If you're thin provisioning down at the storage layer, it can also send SCSI unmap commands down to the storage controller to notify it of blocks that are no longer needed. That works very well with vvols in VMware as well. If your virtual machines are provisioned with dynamically allocated RAM instead of a fixed amount of RAM, such that the hypervisor can borrow some back to reallocate to some other VM in the environment, it's important to make sure that you reserve enough RAM in your SQL VM's configuration for both SQL and Velocity. Otherwise, too much RAM in the VM could become driver locked by the hypervisor's ballooning driver, and that would mean that Velocity might not get enough RAM to cache with effectively. I think it's probably fair to say that most SQL DBAs don't use dynamically allocated RAM, and they assign a fixed amount of RAM to their SQL servers because they tend to be very important machines, and they don't want resource to be stolen away from those. But if you are using dynamically allocated RAM, try and keep that in mind if you're going to do some testing. Now, These are just some of the case studies that you can access on our website at conducive.com, and I've put a few of them in the handout section in the GoToMeeting window as well. So feel free to download some of those if you want some light bedtime reading. As one example, Bell Mobility on the bottom left here, they are a telecoms company over in Canada. And they saw the V-locity software reduce the storage I/O traffic to their SAN storage by 61%. That's a huge reduction in storage workload that the backend storage has to deal with. And simply this gave them SQL report queries that were 3 times faster, with no additional hardware being required. All they had to do was simply install the software, which, as I mentioned earlier, is completely non-disruptive. There are no SQL code changes required, no reboots required, and 0 disruption to any live running workloads, and probably more importantly, no disruption to users. So, next steps. First, I would encourage you to share what you've learned in this session with colleagues. See what they have to say about this. And I'm recording this session as well, which will be made available as an on-demand download in the next day or so. Share this video with them. See what they have to say about this type of technology. Maybe some of them have already used it in the past. But really, I don't want you to take my word for any of this. The simplest and best thing to do really is to try the software for yourself with your real world workloads. Everybody who's attending today will receive a full copy of the software from Conducive directly, worth about £400 or 450 in euros. Make sure you follow the best practice tips that I gave to get best results, and ensure that you leave at least 4 gigabytes of RAM free to cache with. You can also try the software on all of your machines at once with that 30-day trialware version that you can download right now from conducive.com/try. Well, not right now, wait until we've finished, if you don't mind. And honestly, using that 30-day trialware is what I would recommend if you're seriously thinking about testing the software. If you've got a handful of SQL machines in a sea of hundreds of other machines that are all sharing the backend storage, it will be beneficial to those SQL machines, but on average, we reduce the storage I/O traffic by 30 to 50%. So having that out of a handful of SQL machines is helpful, but having that as an overall storage reduction is going to give you much more dramatic results, not just with SQL, but with those other workloads as well. So use that 30-day trialware, get it onto as many machines as you can. It'll run fully featured for 30 days, and really put it to the test and see what it can do for your workloads. And by the way, you're very welcome to share the dashboard report data from the V-locity software with a Conducive engineer like myself and get additional analysis and get a written engineer's report. We don't charge for that, of course. You're very welcome to take advantage of that. And the emails shown on the screen will get you directly connected with the lead engineer for your region. Even if you've got any questions after the presentation, feel free to reach out. You can come to me directly at srseemea@conducive.com, or give us a call if you want to talk about it further. So if your organization would benefit from faster storage at a reasonable price, but using the storage hardware that you already own, I would urge you, give it a try. You're not going to disrupt any live running workloads. You can install and uninstall without affecting anything. You don't have to make any SQL code changes, and the whole download and installation will really take no more than a few minutes. Use the software to not only identify those servers that cause storage I/O issues, but fix those issues at the same time and get faster SQL servers. So I hope this has been interesting. Let's see if we've got any questions come through. Now, Brian says, do you install it on each VM or at the hypervisor layer? That's a great question, Brian. Typically, you would install the software into each guest Windows operating system. That's where you're going to see the most bang for buck. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, if we've got the RAM cache inside that guest Windows OS, it provides really the shortest IO path. If you need to read something and have it satisfied from that cache, it means that it can all happen within that VM without it having to come out down to the hypervisor layer or down to the tier 1 in your SAN storage. So that's very beneficial. Secondly, that's the layer, that guest Windows operating system, that's the layer where writes would get split. And that's where we can prevent those split IO situations from happening. If you try and do that down at the hypervisor layer, well, you can't really, it's too late. That traffic's, it's already been split. Those writes have already been split up. So get it in at that guest Windows operating system level for best results. And then everything below that point in the storage stack benefits by dealing with less workload. And the workload that it does have to deal with is in these larger packets of data that can be dealt with more sequentially and more efficiently. And yeah, just sort of make every layer below the Windows VM work really well and look very good. So we've got oh wow, it's a well-attended session today, and we're getting a great number of questions come through, which is brilliant. I always love to get feedback on this. So Cristiano says it also can benefit the loads on Microsoft Exchange servers. Yes, and we've got a lot of case studies of that as well. I know a lot of people have been moving off to Office 365, but there is still a significant percentage of customers running their own Exchange servers. And it absolutely does help there as well. And they do tend to be servers that are very storage IO intensive. So I would definitely recommend getting it onto any Exchange servers. And Abra says it will reduce batch jobs duration. Often it does. It really depends on what the batch jobs are doing, but if those batch jobs are generating a good amount of storage IO traffic, and we are making that storage IO faster, yes, those batch jobs will tend to complete more quickly. So, definitely give it a try. Jose says, good morning. Can we have the full video of the webinar recording to watch later? Thanks. Yes, I think I mentioned a little earlier, you absolutely can. I am recording this and it will go out to everybody who registered as on-demand content. So you will get that. It might be this afternoon, it might be tomorrow, but if you don't get it in the next couple of days, just ping me an email directly and I will make sure that I get a copy to you. My email address, as I mentioned, is on the screen here, srsemia@conducive.com. Robert says, RSAN is SSD based, pure storage. Random/sequential IO is irrelevant to that, ? Yes, it is. SSDs and all flash arrays are very, very fast. They have a very high IOPS ceiling, which is brilliant. If you have the money to afford one of those, and not everybody does, then that's great. That will give you very fast storage IO traffic. But the storage IO traffic can be slowed down and made less efficient even before it gets to that storage layer, simply by the way that the Windows write driver handles and creates the storage IO traffic right at the top of the storage stack. So, it's fairly easy to test and prove that, but it's also very workload dependent. Robert, as to whether you're going to see a massive improvement in latency, I don't know. It really depends on the workloads that you're running and how close you are to the IOPS ceiling with the storage solution that you have. To give you a rough idea, though, of some testing that I did recently, I wrote a little batch job which runs a 2-hour test, and it basically runs for an hour, generating a very high storage workload with Iometer, which some of you may be familiar with. It was a little utility originally created by Intel to generate I/O traffic either for networks or for storage and measure how well and how fast that storage traffic's being processed. So this batch job runs for an hour with velocity turned off and then for an hour with velocity turned on, so that you can see how much storage traffic a machine can cope with by itself and how much more it can do with the velocity software and its RAM caching. Now, I ran that on my workstation here, which has an NVMe connected SSD, so it's pretty quick. I've got a good amount of RAM in this workstation. I've got 32 gigs of RAM, so plenty to cache with. And by itself, this machine could process, I think it was either 353 or 356 gigabytes worth of storage traffic in the first hour. And in the second hour, that went up to just over a terabyte of storage traffic. So the RAM caching really made a difference, even though I was using that very fast NVMe connected SSD. So I don't know whether you're pushing the performance boundaries of your environment, but give it a try and see. You really don't have anything to lose. If it's not going to give you a huge performance benefit, you'll know fairly quickly. And if it is, well, yeah, we can certainly sell you some licenses. Give it a try. Now, Robert also says, what is the lag introduced for bunching up the transactions? Oh, that's a great question. Actually, there isn't a lag because we're not bypassing the Windows write driver in any way. We're not trying to temporarily buffer anything and then send it on down to the storage and cause a delay in any way. What we're doing is using a very thin storage filter driver that sits in the Windows storage stack that adds an extra layer of intelligence to the Windows write driver so that it can make better choices about where to write to on that NTFS volume. So instead of it finding the next available free space extent that's not big enough, then having to split that write and find another free space extent that's not big enough, it says, hey, write driver, this write you've got to do, put it here on the NTFS volume where there is a large enough area of free space to write that into without having to split it up. So you then get these larger storage I/O packets carrying a larger payload of data on down to the storage without a delay. So Robert, I hope that answers that. Now, Nuno says, is the copy for one Windows system only? Yes, the NFR copy, or not for resale copy, that we're going to provide you is for one machine. So it's one virtual machine or one physical server, and that's yours to keep. You can keep that running for as long as you want. The 30-day trialware, as obviously the name suggests, will run fully featured for 30 days. And if you're serious about testing the software, I would suggest using that 30-day trialware onto as many machines as you can that share that backend storage. That's where you're going to see the most dramatic improvement. But yeah, the NFR copy is just for one Windows system. We're generous. It's over. It's about £400 worth of software, or 450 euros. But we're not so generous that you can start putting it on everything. I'm afraid we do encourage people to buy some licenses at some point. So I hope that answers that, Nuno. Now, Peter says, we are using Proxmox Linux virtualization. Would we install on our SQL VM as well as the app VM, or only on the SQL VM? Okay, now the Velocity software, because it runs in Windows virtual machines, you can run it in the SQL VM and in the app VM if they are using the Windows OS. The Proxmox Linux virtualization or hypervisor that sits underneath that, Velocity that is agnostic to Velocity. It doesn't matter what the hypervisor technology is, whether it's Proxmox or Citrix Zen Server or Hyper-V or VMware. It really doesn't matter to Velocity, and the reason for that is because we are doing all of our improvements above that in the guest Windows virtual machines. So Peter, I would encourage you to put it onto both of those VMs if they're running Windows. and any other Windows VMs as well that you're running that are sharing that same backend storage. That's how you're going to see the biggest performance improvement. Now, if you're also running a mixture of Windows virtual machines and Linux virtual machines, and they're all sharing that same backend storage, even though you can't install the V-locity software onto the Linux VMs directly, they will still benefit if there's a good amount of storage I/O traffic being generated by the Windows part of the estate. You know, you put V-locity into the Windows machines, it's going to reduce the storage I/O traffic by, on average, 30 to 50%. Some people see even more. And what that means is that it tends to decrease the storage I/O queue depths and decrease latency down at that storage layer. And those Linux machines will be able to take advantage of the storage working less hard as well, even if you haven't been able to install the V-locity software on them directly. So Peter, I hope that makes sense. Now, Steve says, does the software affect any block level backups or restore or Veeam, etc., or nothing to worry about? Great question, Steve. Okay, the short answer is there is nothing to worry about. It doesn't affect any block level backups or restores. You know, we're not moving huge amounts of data around. We're just making sure it gets written the best way the first time, if that makes sense. So we're not writing it and then having to rewrite it and move a lot of data around. It's not like the old days where you would have a traditional defrag, where you would write files that become very fragmented, and then you'd have to waste system resources moving parts of files around to bring them back together again. It really doesn't need to do that, because it's avoiding or preventing that fragmentation from happening in the first place. That's a happy byproduct of avoiding those performance losing split IO situations. And we actually have quite a lot of customers who are using Veeam and other backup technologies as well. And a lot of them have come to us and provided testimonials to say things like, well, we put it in for our SQL servers, but you've also shaved 25% off of our backup times, or you've made sure our backups now complete before the working day starts for our users, whereas before it was taking longer and longer to back up and bleeding over into their time. It really depends on what the bottleneck is for your backups as to whether that will work for you or not. But certainly from a technical point of view, nothing to worry about with Veeam or any other type of block level backups or restores. It works absolutely fine, and we've got a lot of customers using it with that type of technology. Now, Robert says, which metric would highlight the system that's a best candidate? Okay, I think I understand the question. It sounds like you're looking to find the best machine to put that NFR software on. Well, if it was me as an engineer doing the testing, as I said before, I would get the software onto, get that 30-day trial onto all of the machines, and then see where you're saving the most storage time or where you get the most latency reduction. And the software will show you that. But if you just want to use the NFR on a single machine, put it on the one you get the most performance complaints about. But really, I would suggest get that trialware onto all of the machines, and then check that dashboard report and see how much storage time is being saved on each one. You might find that it would be worth getting it onto more than one machine, which is usually the case. Abra says, thanks for the earlier answer, as does Jose. You're very welcome, chaps. And Cristiano says, what are the chances that V-locity could cause corrupted data? Do you know what? That's a great question. It really doesn't. I know you would expect me to say that, but let me try and explain why. I think I mentioned before that V-locity isn't bypassing the Windows operating system. It's not bypassing specifically the Windows file system. It is still the standard NTFS write driver creating a standard NTFS IO packet and then sending it on down through that NTFS volume on down to the storage layer. It's Windows that is doing that. We're not trying to do anything clever like on the fly dedupe or compression or buffering. It is Windows that's doing that right. So all we're doing is adding that extra layer of intelligence to that. If velocity was causing corruption, frankly, I would get to hear about it as in my role as technical director for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And I can honestly tell you that we don't have customers reporting corruption. Now, in addition to that, every build of the Velocity software actually goes to Microsoft themselves for certification before it gets released to the public. And Microsoft actually sign for us our storage filter drivers. And the reason they do that is because we regularly go to a Microsoft hosted event called a Plug Fest, which sounds disgusting, but that's what it's called. And basically what this is a gathering of all of the larger, well-known software manufacturers that use storage filter drivers in a Microsoft Windows environment. So aside from Conducive, I'm talking about people like Kaspersky Antivirus, Symantec, Veeam, a lot of other backup companies as well. And what we do at this event is make sure that our storage filter drivers play nicely with all of the other manufacturers' storage filter drivers. And we figure out what altitude works best in the storage stack with all of these other drivers in the mix. As a result, Microsoft sign our filter drivers for us, and we really don't have much in the way of compatibility issues or certainly not corrupted data. So, Cristiano, I hope that puts your mind at rest. Very happy to provide you more information on that if you want to contact me directly after this session. James says, hi, do we get a copy of this webinar so we're able to present to our teams to show the possible benefit of your software? Yes, you absolutely will. As I mentioned before, I am recording this and it will be made available as an on-demand download to all of you. And I would welcome you sharing it with your friends and colleagues in the IT industry to see what they have to say. Some of them will have used this before in the past, I'm sure, and can discuss it with you. And you're also welcome to discuss it with us so that we can really get a good understanding of what type of environment you're running and see if and where we can provide the most benefit for you, because everybody's environment is different. Some people are running a hybrid where some is in the cloud and some in the data center. Some people are just in the data center. Some people are running just physical servers. Some people are running just virtual or a mixture of the two. Everybody's different. Everybody's got different storage. They're running different workload types, but we are pretty expert at finding out just how we can help your type of environment. We get to speak with thousands and thousands of people with all different types of environment all over the world. So use that wealth of knowledge and see if we can help you. So Nuno says, what is your USP? I'm assuming that means unique selling point. As you can probably tell, I'm not really a marketing or sales guy. I'm more of a techie and more of an engineer, but I think you mean unique selling point. It's a good question. We have a few things like being able to do more with your existing storage without the need for additional storage hardware. Let's say, for example, you're stuck with a SAN that's got 15K SAS drives in it, and maybe you don't have the budget for that next storage refresh that's got flash in it or an all flash array. Maybe you don't have the budget for that. Well, we can give you much faster performance and lower latency just with a simple software utility that's a hell of a lot cheaper than that next storage upgrade. The RAM caching is very much a unique selling point because of the way we use that artificial intelligence to learn about the workloads that you're running, to give them the best performance gains over time. I'm sure there are others as well, but as far as I'm aware, we don't really have any significant direct competitors for this technology. Now, of course, there are other caching technologies out there in the marketplace, but they typically tend to require you to purchase hardware to make them work, whether it's some flash or SSD sitting in the physical host hypervisor and caching there, or a tray of flash in the tier 1 of your SAN. These other caching engines tend to require hardware to work. Our software doesn't. It's very good at using the environment that you already own. And I think that's a pretty good USP as well. So I hope that helps, Nuno. And let's see. Robert says, thanks for the Q&A. You're very welcome, sir. And Nuno says, thank you for your patience and clarification. Nuno, you are welcome too. It's been my pleasure. I think that's the end of the questions. Please, if you think of any others after the session, you're very welcome to send me an email. And I would really genuinely love to hear what piqued your interest to come along today. What was it about the V-locity software that thought, that looks interesting for my environment? Are there issues there that you need to solve that we can help with? We genuinely want to help people out there. We're not just here to sell software. We really want to make a difference to people's performance and productivity. So please don't feel shy in getting in touch with us. We really do genuinely want to help you. So that being said, thank you very much, everybody, for joining me today. I hope it's been interesting, and I will look forward to speaking with some of you soon. Take care and have a very good rest of day.